Hello, all, and welcome to the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Fanatics podcast. I'm your host, Coolbaugh. Today, I have me a very special guest, R. Virdi. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, when Adrian approached me, I was like, "Yeah, like, do I have to reply? Do I have to RSVP? Like, just send him my way, and we'll get him on and do the thing." I had the first binding on my list for quite some time, so I'm really glad that when Adrian emailed me, he goes, "Okay, do you have a copy?" I'm like, "No, not yet. I'm like really want the paperback because it's just beautiful." He's like, "Well, here's the EPUB." So I read the first chapter actually that night, and then I had to buy the Audible book the next day,
Oh, thank
and
you.
I was absolutely like floored. I absolutely love your prose, I have to say,
Thank
and
you.
just like just the beginning chapters. Like I could totally see where you sold it like very easily. I feel like to just the reader, and it's been absolutely awesome. I'm really bummed that I've been so busy I haven't been able to get through more of the chapters. My buddy asked me, he's like, "How's it going?" I was like, "Dude, you have to get this book." And then one of our other friends for Father's Day. That's why I was before we got recording. I said I was trying to find a
Oh,
physical copy, so I'm trying to give it to him for Father's Day.
oh wow, thank you.
I'll have to get it like on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or something sent to him because we can't find a copy anywhere, which is a good thing and a good problem to have, right? But awesome, awesome book. So I'm really excited to have you on today and to get to talk about it. So
Thank you so much.
yeah, for sure. And we'll go right with that first question. What has your writing journey been like up until this point?
Oh wow.
An epic one, right?
Yeah, it's been a lot of ups and emotional downs because it was very confusing. So it started. I published in 2013, so right after the Kindle Gold Rush of like 2011, 2012 happened. Um, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I wasn't trying to pursue traditional publishing because I'd already started hearing some horror stories when I started, getting online more and learning about where the industry was going and things like trend chasing. And then one of my favorite genres is urban fantasy, which at the time, traditional publishing was like sort of chopping down on because they'd
Yeah.
already created their established names. And we started looking online. There was a lot of stuff coming out about like how if you're not XYZ already having published since the mid 2000s in urban fantasy, we're not going to look at your manuscript. And I was like, okay, well, why bother? I love the genre. If I self-publish, I'll get to write what I want and learn that way. I'll cut my teeth, get reviewer comments, and I just didn't want to waste time in my mind of going through slush piles. I wanted to create and learn, and I come from a very blue collar background of where anything you want to do, you don't necessarily need to get a degree for it. You just start learning.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I grew up around mechanics and car guys ever since I was like a teenager, and a lot of these guys didn't have degrees, and they were better than some guys who got their 2-year degree as a mechanic because they
Yeah,
worked
yeah.
on lives. And I was like, okay, I can take writing the same approach. It's a craft, and it was just really weird. I launched Great Beginnings with a really bad cover, and there was a lot of mistakes in it, typo mistakes, because that's my big weakness. And then it was weird. I had a fan who was a developmental editor read it, going like, "This is great. Do you mind if I just like help you work on fixing it?" And they offered to do that pro bono because they really liked the core story.
Oh wow.
And then an aspiring cover artist read it, like, "I really love this. Can I do your cover for you?" And I was like, "What?" And it kind of just pieced together. And I wrote book two, taking a year off because I wanted to work just on my craft. So I did everything I could to study on craft indie. And we launched book two, and a few months later, I found out it was up for the Dragon Award alongside Jim Butcher, N.K. Jemisin, Brandon Sanderson, and other names, which kind of started changing things for me. The Verge and a few big articles covered it, and overnight there was this huge influx of readers checking it out. My monthly income went up, and at that time, it allowed me to go full time. And since then, I just started taking more risks indie, writing different genres, just chasing craft things. I wanted to learn different voice and stuff, and I never felt pressure as an indie because I was allowed. There wasn't deadlines, and there wasn't like
Hmm.
you need to make X, Y, and Z to out earn. It was just can I afford to write the next best book of my life and push myself. And about 2019, things started changing because I had written a novelette, just a little bit larger than a short story with a friend of mine, Yuthunjaya Wijaratne from Sri Lanka, and it was a love letter in response to Pacific Rim. That we
Oh,
call it,
cool.
yeah, Messenger, and it was about the idea of at this time we clocked. I think there was supposed to be some incoming giant astral body coming into our galaxy.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
Waymamu or something. I can't pronounce it. It was Oumama, and it was like 1.7 kilometers long, and nobody knew what it was at the time. And we posited the cool idea of what if silicon aliens came from outer space to Earth because we have a lot of silicon and other elements in our environment. But the one thing we thought was weird was how in a lot of alien movies they always invade Earth first. And I'm like, I mean, not Earth, the United States. And it's like, well, why? How do they know to invade that? Do they have an understanding of military
Yeah,
power? And I was
yeah,
like, if this is a real, just simple alien invasion at first, they would probably go for density of human population, which would be China and India. So we wrote this short story of like, what if China and India came up with the first mechs to fight um these giant invading aliens, our kaiju story. And what happened was the humans couldn't take the stress of being in these giant mechs, the impact that they were taking. So they start digitizing humans into AI instead. So there's no physical weak point in the mech. So they have a human body getting hurt. But the problem with that is human soldiers get PTSD. And we were like, what's the AI equivalent? And we started positing that in India, especially with a lot of the cultural worship that goes on, these mechs were built sort of in the image and name of Hindu gods.
oh, that's
So
cool.
over time, as they become new heroes, we took the idea of how Jaeger pilots were heroes in Pacific Rims of these are new age deities that are being worshipped for protecting people. But the AI, as it goes through stress, since it can't have the biochemical reaction of PTSD, it starts going through a process we called fragmentation, which starts breaking off pieces of itself to survive. And the AI human starts believing that it's actually the god. And there's so as the novel as the story goes along, there's this dissonance of it stops treating people like people and it starts seeing them like ants, but it still believes it's a god here to protect them. And it's this whole story of like this AI sort of falling apart in this mech, trying to do its human duty to protect people, but starting to believe it's a god. And that ended up placing for the Nebula for best novelette as a finalist, which got us invited there. And from that point, things started really weirdly changing. I was approached by a lot of agents at the convention, and I had already started working on Tales of Tremaine. Like this was, I had like maybe 2 to 3 chapters of a sample, and Tantor and Audible were already interested in it because the original process for it was supposed to be it was like a serialized picaresque. It was going to be episode by episode, like a radio play. Um, and then I got all this weird stuff happening where agents were like, "Oh, we love it, but it's too big. No one's going to publish this. It's too big. A 300K story can't sell right now." And the year went on, and I later bumped into an editor. I didn't know it was an editor. I was actually meeting with another editor, and he happened to be there. And this was a guy who edits for tabletop RPGs. And we
Hmm.
were just talking Wheel of Time and nerdy stuff. And the guy next to there turns out was a tour editor, which I didn't know. And he's like, "What are you working on right now?" And I just started telling him about Tales of Tremaine. And he's like, "Yeah, don't sell it to Audible. Send it to me, and I'll read it." And I was like, "Why?" He's like, "Well, I'm a tour editor." And I was like, "Okay." I didn't think anything would come of it. And a month and a half later, he got back saying, like, "We utterly love the sample. We're gonna buy the first 3 books. Just send us this." And I told him I didn't have an agent, and his words were, "Go pick one." So it's been a really weird roller coaster of confusion. I can't like pin down how it all worked out. I was just trying to chase and write books that I really loved and try to get better between them.
I'm sorry, what was the novelette called? Because that just
Uh,
sounds amazing.
Messenger, I can actually just send you a free copy
Messenger,
of
okay.
it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I,
It's 11, 14,000 words. I don't think it's
yeah,
up for
yeah.
sale anymore. It was part of it, an anthology. So I
Oh,
can just
okay.
send you a free copy of it. Yeah.
Oh my God, that's I'm just sorry. I just it popped up in my mind. I've been having I got done with Ness Brown's The Scourge
Mhm.
Between Worlds. Oh my God. And like since then, like it's been hard for me to get back into like any type of sci-fi because I think I just dumped so hard after that one because and I mean it was just such a good fast-paced like novella and stuff. But yeah, that sounds like right up my alley. That sounds just absolutely so cool.
Oh,
So
thank you. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to definitely check that out. Well, you just said so many cool things there. It's really hard to figure out which one to dissect. But I just want to point out to the audience that, it's just so interesting to me that, there's just so many things that have happened to you that, I've talked to different authors and, we try to explain to people, like Adrian said this too, when he was on with Mushroom Blues, we're just trying to encourage people to go to events. And like James Lloyd Lynn was like, "Oh, you live near me." I'm like, "Yeah, like 3 hours." And he's like, "Hey, let's go to like a Comic Con together and sell books." And I'm like, "When?" He goes, "Well, what's up? What's coming up?" So we're doing that hopefully like this fall. And then other people were like wanting to get involved too. So like we're basically gonna like come up with like our own like writing crew for like the East Coast, which I think is awesome. And if I didn't do this podcast, there's just so many people I wouldn't meet or get to talk to, like yourself, and I don't know, I've met some really good friends. So I try to tell people like I just saw people like 3 years ago asking for stuff all the time. And I'm like, well, maybe just give something to the community. And you just never know. I thought it'd be like 10 episodes, and here I am booked for like 2 seasons after this. I think I'm getting into season 6, honestly. And then I still
Congrats, man.
no, yeah, it's awesome. I'm like, it's a great problem to have, but it's hard because I just want to talk to so many people, and get to do whatever. And it's cool now to get on other people's podcasts, and on lives and stuff, and people know who I am, and we'll divulge different information or email me later, and I don't know, it's just really cool. So yeah, you just have some cool stories there, I think, and some cool experiences that just show people that if you just get out there and keep working on craft. I think people say it all the time, but it really does work. So I think it's just a great example of that. But
Yeah.
super cool. Well, I'm so glad that that happened to you, because it's just so funny that there's so many authors that I have on here that there's that book in the drawer that they thought they would never take out again, and then that's their first binding, or what I mean. And it's just kind of crazy. It's almost like there's a muse out in the world that wants books like yours, which I'm really glad for, because they end up being some of my favorite books that I've read. So I think that's really super cool. But that's awesome. um what do you think was like the craziest set of circumstances, like in terms of you getting from like the start to like right now? Would it be just randomly popping
Oh,
into that editor, or would that be like
no, it would be and I've shared this story before, that growing up, that Jim Butcher was or is my favorite author, and I've gone through some pretty hard life stuff, and I've struggled with depression, with suicidal ideation for a very long time. Fortunately, I'm doing a lot better now through a lot of therapy and experimental stuff. And what was weird was, and I've talked about the story in the first bindings dedicated to Butcher for this, but he saved my life around when I was 21. I think this was a few months after Ghost Story had come out. I don't know how long. It was not a year. Ghost Story had just launched because he was doing the promotional tour for it. And
mm,
I met him at a signing, and he said some very powerful stuff to me that changed the course of my life. And I had always wanted to hope one day that I could learn from him. Because in terms of craft, he was an author I most resonated with, the way his stories are written. Even though I'm a pantser, I religiously study craft. And growing up with a lot of mystery detective genre novels, as well as urban fantasy, which is my favorite reading genre. There's a lot of overlap between how detective novels and thrillers are written to urban fantasy, and a lot of similar craft aspects for the popular detective style of urban fantasy. And it became very weird that after meeting him, that my first award nomination was with him in the same genre, which obviously also meant that I knew I wasn't going to win. I had no hope in hell. But and then a few years later, he actually reached out to me out of the blue, because we weren't in contact. It's not like he knew me like as a friend or anything personally. And I don't know what he'd been hearing about me or my books and stuff, but he just added me on social media and reached out saying he wanted to mentor me,
oh,
which
that's cool.
is the craziest. Like growing up, uh, idolizing a specific author and their works, and the set of circumstances to the impact they had on your life, and then that mentorship. And now my traditional debut is dedicated to him. It it genuinely beggars belief. I actually found I sound a little. I feel like I'm crazy talking about it like that, because it sounds crazy when I hear it aloud.
No, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Put it in that perspective, and I don't know how that happens. Like, there's no set of circumstances I can imagine. Like, how does that work out? Like, those, yeah. It's definitely one of those like life is stranger than fiction moments, because fiction is plotted and life does not seem to be.
Yeah, yeah. Now I have to say, just to me, it's odd that you say this, because Richard Lee Byers was one of my favorite authors, one of 3 authors that I was reading growing up, and I wasn't really into fantasy, and then I got into Forgotten Realms, and then I happened to read them for a while, but then I read one of his books, and I got to actually interview him on this podcast, and
That's so cool.
yeah, and I was talking about my first fantasy novel and stuff, and I was like, yeah, I'm having difficulty. And he's like, oh, when you're ready, like send it to me and I'll help you. And I was just like, what is going on right now? So
Right, right.
I totally get it. Like, and it was, they say don't meet your heroes, but I always tell them pick different heroes then,
But
because,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
like,
that's really well said. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And it was crazy because Elaine Cunningham is another one. And like, she just got me through so many just like tough times. And it's just, he was like, yeah, just let me know whenever you're ready, and I will, yeah, I'll hook you guys up. So I'm really hoping to talk to her in the future. And then Tim Pratt, like one of the people from Angry Robot Books, was like, oh yeah, Tim's on our list, like we'll get you hooked up with him this summer. And I was just like, what is happening right now where I'm going to be able to interview, like I've interviewed 1 out of the 4, so I totally get it. It's just it's so cool when those people are cool,
Yeah.
and and you can I try to explain to Richard, I'm like, the things that you did for me, which you don't even know, is just really cool. So yeah, I totally get that. That's an awesome story though. That's so
Okay.
cool. You're totally right though. Life is stranger than fiction for sure. I think that's the problem though, is life is a pantser for sure. So
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
so you talked a little bit about genres, but I'm curious, like, and you talked about urban fantasy. So I'm curious that, like, I get urban fantasy because that's actually where I'm starting with, and I'm a huge fantasy person, but I really love urban fantasy, and I mean, you know why? It's so cool. You can take those, blends between present day and
Yes.
just
That's exactly
insert
why I
so
love it.
many cool. Yeah, I have so much history stuff that I know because I'm a history teacher, and I want to put it into this urban fantasy world. So I get that, but like, I'm kind of curious at why you switched to fantasy for the first binding.
Ah, that's a really good question. At that time, I was actually reading a lot of interesting life biographies because I have a weird, like, almost like a fetish for it. Like the greatest lives ever lived, or these crazy stories
Yeah,
about. You've probably seen this trending on like social media about like how one guy from Asia sailed around the world to meet his like love in Sweden or something. I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
so cool. And I
Yeah.
was like, and as a huge mythology and history buff, I always saw this thing where a lot of legendary characters and heroes have this almost monologue where they're like, I am so and so, I've done X, Y, and Z, and I'm like the greatest, coolest person in the world. Like the Celtic god Luke has one of those. It shows up in our fiction as well for modern day. In fact, I believe in I can't remember if it's Battlegrounds or Peace Talks. But Butcher has a scene where Harry is talking to a Jotun or a giant, and it's asking him like, "Who are you? Like, tell me your name, so I know the pleasure of who I'm killing," which was a real thing too. Samurais would tell me like, "Who are you? What are your deeds?" Like, I want to know
Yeah.
who I'm about to fight, and Harry rattles off everything he's done, and he's like, "Who the f are you?" And the Jotun's like, "I fought the Odin's son and lived," and Harry's like, "Oh." And I always thought that was a cool concept in uh, just history, mythology, and fiction, and I'm also a huge mythology buff, particularly comparative mythology. And growing up, I started realizing how many myths across the world were very similar, including
Yeah.
epics and many beats. But most people don't know about that in the West because they're only familiar with the Western mythology of like the
Yep.
Odyssey, the Song of Roland, the Iliad, not even some of the Norse epics, until more recently, where we started getting Norse retellings and publishing. And I wanted to sort of go back to the South Asian ones and sort of show it through a South Asian lens in terms of what could I do with fantasy that is also a giant, cool, mythological, comparative mythological and storytelling flex. Because it makes me happy when I read and study that, and I'm like, this is the book I wanted. And the further I started diving into it, I'm like, okay, well, I really like poetry. I've been writing it since I was a teenager. I just didn't talk about it because angsty emo teenage phase, right? And all these things I sort of love started coalescing into this, and it just became like I've already written fantasy at this point. I wrote a space western solely for the love of being able to write Western language in space.
Yeah, yeah.
My standalone novel Star Shepherd was literally just a love letter to I want to play with language and have a fun pulpy space western where I get to write like how people talk in Firefly because I absolutely love language and different accents and how people talk and communicate in works of fiction. I had written a lit RPG at this point about 2018, so before the genre got to where it was now, and fantasy just felt like everything of my personal passions and depth kind of culminated to like I need to write this for me. It was supposed to be a personal project, like I said, just that I was going to serialize. I didn't think it was going to be commercial or anything, and it's been a really weird, kind of ironic journey in that because again, talking about the Jim Butcher thing, he's talked about where when he was starting out, he wanted to be like Tolkien. He was actually writing swords and sorcery, high fantasy, and he couldn't sell it. And his teacher was like, "You don't shut up about things like Little K Hamilton and like Buffy, I think had just started coming out." She's like, "Why don't you write something like that?" And he goes like, but then he did it, and that was his like explosion into traditional. And for me, I always wanted to be like Butcher, and I started writing urban fantasy, and it was doing well, but I wrote a fantasy the exact opposite, and that's what got me into traditional. Yeah, it's just more weirdness.
Yeah. His story about like just like really like his first three books and just like that whole thing is was just so cool. I'm like totally blanking on, I think it was like Daniel B. Green, I think. Interviewed him maybe like 2 years ago. It was just it blew my mind, like some of the insights and things that he was
Mhm.
saying about that. And that's where people ask me like, why do you like to write different things? I'm like, I like sci-fi, I like fantasy, I like some mix of horror. I'm like, I just like you said, I like craft. there's so many different things I like to read, so there's so many different things I like to write. And if you don't write them, I feel like you'll never be able to, to flex that muscle, even
Exactly.
in, yeah, like Richard, like Lee Byers, like Richard does such an amazing job combining like horror with fantasy. And then he has like his Marvel stuff with I'm totally Heimdall, the Marvel Heimdall, unfortunately not the Idris Elba one. They couldn't get the rights for him, I guess. But yeah, but he went with the original comic one. So it's like this amazing mix of like blend of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. And I'm like, it was like chef's kiss. Like it was beautifully done. And I'm like, I want to be able to do that because
Hmm.
there's so many cool things. And I always tell people it's like a recipe, right? Like sometimes you have, a certain percentage of different things and it makes that recipe depending on the story. So I don't know. I thought that was really cool. So I totally get the craft aspect, but yeah, that's super cool. Did you end up publishing your RPG then, or?
Yeah, yeah. The first two are published. I haven't had time, unfortunately, to write book three, but
Gotcha.
I don't think there's any demands like crazy for it. The first two books did pretty well, but it was in a weird space where lit RPG was at the time because I wrote something very out of the
Yeah.
norm. When lit RPG started, there was certain like very popular styles, and I wrote something way on the darker side.
Mm.
Because the games that I loved that I wanted to sort of nod to were Dark Souls.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
and I wanted to nod to Monster Hunter, the JRPG franchise, because
Oh, cool.
I grew up with a lot of those, and it, a lot of early lit RPG was focused on the popular cool escapism aspect, and
Yeah, yeah.
I wrote a world that's not fun to be in because the world's actively trying to kill the players. Not like you have fun in quests. Like I wrote it based on some socio-political stuff of like how we're seeing the fallout of China's one-child policy, where now there's certain population crises among the young. Um, the argument that people have been making that the world's overpopulated and overcrowded, which I don't agree with, but I was like, what if I take this to a further level of like the 100 or Logan's Run, where
Oh,
there's a population crisis and Earth's no longer been inhabitable. Disasters have happened, so people live on space stations, and children born outside of a one-child policy are sort of kept as indentured servants because the kids are born and they need labor class, and then at 18 they're unfortunately executed, just to save room. Yeah. However, they came up with a humane way to do this, where it's like, okay, to and it looks good socially for this ruling class. Like, okay, we're no longer killing kids. What we're doing is when they're 18, we're uploading their consciousness into a stored data, and we're making it fun for them. It's a video game world,
mm.
and it buys the ruling class sort of some like I guess some slack in terms of like, okay, this is more acceptable, and their human bodies are still discarded, but like they get to live on, and then they find out that the video game world is still actively trying to kill them and remove them. And so far, the story has been about one character sort of going like, no, F that, and he's trying to slowly build a new community where they can survive the world. Um, and I have the cover for book three. But this was literally the year where Tremaine took off, so that changed so many career course stuff for me.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, that's crazy. I must have missed those because like when I was going through like Goodreads, and which is like the problem I found recently with a few people like yourself who've written multiple books and in different genres. It's like it's not putting them all together, whereas it used to I could
Yeah,
just go
yeah,
down and you know what I mean? Amazon too has been kind of weird. It'll just
yeah. It
do like
has.
yeah, so it was like you and two other authors I like missed stuff and I'm like, well, this is stupid because like those
I'll
are
send you
books
the
that are
audio
for me.
codes.
Okay,
I,
cool.
I think
Well,
I
I'm
still
just
get the
like,
free audio codes, so I'll
yeah,
send you
yeah.
something like Audible. Yeah.
Oh man, yeah. Well, I'm just like, why are you not giving somebody who that's the perfect audience for? I just try to explain to somebody like it's been so hard lately to sell books. I'm like, I get it because I'm like, I follow you, I follow all these other people, these all three authors, and you would think that they'd be trying to sell those books to me, and it just makes no sense. So I
Yeah,
think that's
yeah,
one reason why it's also hard is with whatever they did to that algorithm on both of them, like last fall or whatever it was, summer. Yeah, it kind of really like messed things up, I think, for people to
absolutely.
find their audience. So as if it wasn't hard enough already.
Right, right, right.
Yeah, well, that's really cool. Definitely looking forward to those. And this is definitely always my favorite question to ask people is about their books explicitly. So what are your tales of Tremaine books about, and how did you come up with the idea for the first binding?
Ooh, okay. So in terms of about, and then also sort of like how I came up with it, were almost the same.
Hmm.
Originally, I had a standalone novel that I still want to do. That was a different world, and it was a post-colonization world,
Ooh.
and I had another character who was like the greatest living legend in horror of his time. It's a completely different tone of the book. It's a lot darker. It's a story about vengeance and an overthrowing an empire in one book. Um, and there was a character when I was drafting this who came up called the Storyteller. That's all he was, and he had a very similar mirror analog story to the protagonist.
Mhm.
And there's a conversation that's supposed to happen where like they're trading legends, and I
Oh,
started fleshing
cool.
out the Storyteller more, and Ari sort of took over. That book got backburnered, and Ari just kind of stole the show, which fits his personality. And then, like I
Sure.
talked about the other inspirations from history and stuff, it became a love letter to storytelling and comparative mythology of because a lot of people don't know this, but the frame narrative originated in South Asia. The structure belongs to our epics, which in English would be called Ramayana or Ramayana, and Mahabharat, or in English, the Mahabharata. And it comes from there, as well as some of our oldest other structural stories. Like we have one called Panchatra, which is a collection of fairy tales and fables that historians have now shown might have contributed 30 to 40% of all fairy tales around the world. The
Oh, wow.
structures, the beats, and fables from them, yeah. Some people have heard of 1001 Nights. You have Canterbury Tales, the Decameron. We have one called Vikram Vital, which is like Vikram and the Vampire.
Oh, cool.
That's also a fame narrative. And then you have obviously popular fiction like Interview with the Vampire and so many others that I loved. And I'm like, if I'm going to tell the story of the greatest legend, and it's a story about storytelling too, because Ari posits this where he talks about how there's similar stories out in the world and they've all inspired each other, and he's chasing one of them. I want it to become really meta referential. So it references popular fiction. There's a lot of comparative storytelling and mythological beats from multiple cultures presented in a new lens for this world. But if people have read their history, they'll go like, "Oh, that's that myth," but it also happens to be another culture's myth and another one, another one. So the myths I use to sort of tell some of the stories inside are actually like five different cultures' myths of the same thing.
Oh,
And
that's
it,
cool.
it started ballooning into this like weird meta fiction piece of storytelling with a storyteller told in a way that an oral performing storyteller would for oral pleasure. And it just became like this very giant like PhD craft nerd thesis for myself of how far can I get into the history of storytelling and then make it as meta as I can. I kind of took it as a passion as well as a challenge, which has been great, but also really stressful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that explains why I've enjoyed it so much.
Thank you.
Because the history of storytelling, I think, is just absolutely incredible. And such a myth nerd. And my students have literally asked me, like, they're like, which ones do you think are the best? And I was like, not the ones that get told the most.
Yeah.
To be honest, I have like a like native Hawaiian type mythological fantasy that I want to do where like tattoos essentially are like their magic comes from this particular thing that they put in their
Mhm.
tattoos, and they can do different things. And once Moana came out, I was like, yeah, this is like totally my kind of thing. And there's just so many. I always tell them, I'm like, there was a graphic novel. I'm totally gonna blank on what it was, but it was like one of the greatest like Indian myths. And this guy just did like the greatest, like I'll have to send it to you, but like the greatest art I've ever seen. And it's still on my list to purchase. And it like inspired me so much in college. I was flipping through it, and then it sold out. And I think it's on its like third or fourth, maybe fifth, like reprinting. And I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do, because everybody else does like Western myths and stuff.
Right.
Like Gilgamesh too,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
you know what I mean, to go and try and analyze those, I think is just so cool. And to try and go meta on it is even a better idea, I think. But yeah, it's just there's so many cool myths out there, and to always get the same Greek and Roman or whatever, it gets really boring to me. That's like fantasy too, I think. Like I'm not a big you're not gonna see a lot of like Western Europeans, honestly, in my fantasy world. You'll have a couple of groups, but then I have a lot of other groups that I like to see represent. I think they're just so cool. But I really like, Ari, just because I'm like, okay, is he telling the truth or
Right. Unreliable
not? To
narrators.
Yeah, and like he's just such a great character. Like when people ask like who's one character you want to have a conversation with, I'm like, that would be definitely like top three for me. But then
Mhm.
afterward, I'd be like, did he tell me the truth or was it a story? Or but I think that's what makes his character so unique is, I just keep I keep it makes me want to keep reading, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
On top of the myths that you have, brought into, your world building. So now the fact that it's meta is like even cooler to me. So, which is why I like to do these interviews. It's almost like I get the director's cut as I before I read or once I'm reading people's books and stuff. So that's like super super cool. What I'm just kind of curious, like in terms of so since you said it's meta, I'm just kind of curious, like in terms of like what stories maybe in particular, like what were some in particular or myths that you kind of went with to kind of go with some of the main
Ooh.
focus.
So this is a nesting story in book one that you'll come up with way later, but Ari is retelling of their world, like the birth of a virginal birth of essentially a god.
Hmm.
Uh born of himself, a son of himself, which the way it's narrated seems very similar to the Jesus story. However, in South Asia, we have an older story, which is just the birth of Karan uh, to Surya and Kunti, which is a virginal birth, where she prays and a solar deity, Surya, the sun god, actually gives her a boon, and she gives birth to Karan. Um, and then later, she's kind of ashamed because she has this virginal birth, which she feels kind of leaves her impure, and she sends the baby down river in a basket, which is Moses.
Yeah.
Um, and this is a real story. And being familiar with this, and this is a simple Google. I always tell people just to get a primer, which is really fascinating about cultures descended from Proto-Indo-European, because the Vedic South Asian culture is, as well as the Norse and the Greek, along with some others. They have very similar myths and beats throughout their epics. You can cursory just Google like the similarities between the Iliad and the Odyssey, as well as Mahabharata and Ramayana. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of beat for beat similar character arcs, character archetypes, exact, almost similar moments, just obviously interpreted through a different cultural lens. And it's something that inspired me of like the greatest epics have these beats for multiple different reasons, either being descended from similar cultures where we don't have, unfortunately, access to all the Proto-Indo-European stories, but it seems like there's enough linguistic, like etymological evidence of like where certain gods came from certain names and certain roles, and then their interpretation would sort of be similar. Um, and I want to draw from those because it's supposed to be a love letter to storytelling, but also the comparative nature to show how similar stories have been around the world and feature Ari sort of as the new proto-hero. Another myth I talk and teach a lot about is the Dragon Slayer myth, especially Thor versus Jormungandr, which is very similar to Indra versus Vitra, who were both gigantic dragon-like serpents. In the case of Vitra, he was an Asura or a demon who, like a celestial kind of being, had the ability to shapeshift, and he became a multi-headed dragon, particularly three-headed, and he held all the waters of the world hostage. And Indra is a storm god, much like Thor, who slays him with in his case, he has a proto club. It's called the Vajra. When you look at it, it looks like an old warhammer, similar to Thor's Mjolnir, and they both have the power of a thunderbolt in them. There are iterations where if Indra throws his hammer, it comes back to him, just like Thor's.
Oh, cool.
And they're not the only storm gods who have done that. There's Baal and Hadad. There's Marduk and Tiamat. Marduk was also the Babylonian or Sumerian storm god who kills Tiamat, the chaos dragon. Um, so I use a lot of similar myths like that and their evolutions because over time we started adapting our gods to become demigods, and then the demigods had very similar stories beat wise to some of the gods, and then we brought them to heroes. Again, the Dragon Slayer myth being the most popular because we went from demigods to later killing them, like Zeus kills Typhon, the hundred-headed dragon Titan, and then Apollo kills Python, another draconic or serpentine being, and then we have going all the way down to Achilles killing the Hydra, another serpent motif being, and then dial it back up to humans where we have Saint George versus the Dragon Slayer. Um, and in fact, this is also a comparative aspect that I love is how early myths influence the structure of stories. Because one name for Indra is, in translated English, is remover of the first obstacle, or also the first dragon slayer. But remover of the first obstacle, when you get to storytelling structure, the obstacle that you're supposed to overcome is usually the climax of the story. And it's what led to dragon slaying becoming the climax of a lot of classic stories for a long time, where you slay the dragon, because structurally it was presented as that this is the big obstacle for the hero to overcome. All the way up to the very famous Star Wars, where the Death Star quite literally represents a dragon as a climax, because it is this presence that holds the galaxy at risk, has the power to destroy everything. On top of it, on board of it, is a captured princess, which is very common to the dragon slaying archetype of the dragon
Yeah.
holding a princess. And the whole point of the story is for the plucky hero to realize he can destroy the dragon, which is the climax where Luke uses the Force to make the unsinkable shot and blows up the Death Star. And the original dragon slaying myths along their evolution are similar to that. The first dragons didn't kidnap princesses; they held resources. If you go back, they blocked off water access to when we were just beginning to become agricultural from nomadic, and we needed bodies of water. Then there's actually cattle stealing. The original dragons stole cows and cattle because they were agriculturally important for meat and milk. And this evolved as our societies changed to become more, not industrial, but maybe more capitalistic in terms of like now we have giant empires and kingdoms. What became the next big commodity is princesses. And so what did dragons start doing? They start hoarding wealth and princesses. As our societal values changes of what we needed to survive and what we valued, what the dragon stole from us changed as well. But the dragon still became the big obstacle to overcome for the longest time. And structurally, there's a lot of arguments. That's why dragons for the longest time were like the climax of the story, overcoming one. And there's beats of that too in Tales of Tremaine.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, you blew my mind there. I never actually really realized that because some of the oldest myths with them and other monsters, yeah, are more resource based.
Mhm.
I could think I'm like I actually just taught about two of them a while back, and they were both I can't remember if they were Chinese or if it was Japanese, but both of those dragons in this water.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, that's crazy. Just blew my mind there, man. That's really cool. Somebody asked me recently, like, why is the history and myth of storytelling so interesting to you? And I'm like, how is it not to you? Like
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
writer, like I don't know. And I think there's so many cool things that you can learn from that. And just loving Star Wars and especially A New Hope. And
Mhm.
but just like once I got older and realized like, what he actually did with combining myths and different storytelling and stuff, like that actually made it just so much cooler to me. And actually more interesting, I think, even more than liking the characters and the world and whatever. But just liking just knowing where, like Obi-Wan's supposed to be Merlin and stuff like that, or
Yep.
just whatever, I just think that that stuff's really cool. So I think knowing things like that, like you're saying though, and deconstructing how other people, because those are famous stories, right? And they got them from other people. And I think that Ari too, though, like, when he's like explaining, not really like, I think just like narratively, right? Or thinking of like, what's the best way to capture this audience? And
Mhm.
there's certain checklist things that he has, right? That he has to do in order to make it the best, not story, but way he's telling the story, I think makes total sense because then you're talking about craft. And then I think it goes directly into writing it. So I think that that's
Right,
really
right, right.
cool. So, which I think makes, his narrative so much more interesting, as a writer, because you're kind of dissecting like, oh, how is he telling his story? And then I think you can learn a lot from that. So I think that's really cool. Um, so I just loved the description of blurb where you mentioned all legends are born of truth and just as much lies. These are mine. Judge me for what you will, but you will hear my story first. And I'm kind of curious too with your the quote on your cover where it says every great story starts with a lie. So I'm kind of curious at how you came up with this concept of lies in helping to tell Ari's story.
Part of it is just human experience, and everyone's heard like the whole game of telephone, and I'm sure everyone's had a high school experience where you heard a rumor and like it goes so far, it's changed so much from the truth.
Yeah.
And I've always like, wow, rumors and lies spread so much faster than truth. And I never understood why, but I understood the human nature of gossip. And I was like, it's such a great way to build a legend of someone doing something, having it twisted, taken, or even them spreading the lie themselves. And with Ari's story, as it evolves, you'll see and learn. Sometimes it's for necessity and protection to keep himself safe, because a reputation can also be a shield as much as it can be a noose around your neck.
Yeah.
And it became a very natural way of storytelling for me within the novel. And the more I researched, I realized that's how so many novels and stories spread. A great history of this is Marco Polo, where
Mm.
he, in his journals, he left behind, I told everyone only half of what I saw, for if I told the truth, I knew I would not be believed. And he told some pretty outlandish stuff in what he did say. And I was like, how much was lie? How much was truth? The history of fantastical beasts, even half the time, were lies or just assumptions. There's a great story about how mythological creatures are born. And the griffin is technically, for example, a Greek creature. It was created by the Greeks. However, it's an Indian creature in that it was a creature that the Greeks believed existed in India. They didn't know if it was real or not, but like it stuck and it became a very famous European symbol, motif, and monster. But it's funny that it came into creation because other cultures believed this mystical creature existed in another country. So they
That's
started
interesting.
telling. So same with the Indus Valley worm, which is kind of like a predecessor to the dune worm. They believed cultures believed that India had these giant like death worms that were like massively long, like in these valleys. Um, there's a great story called The Three Princes of Serendip, which is one of the oldest names of Sri Lanka, Serendip, and also where the style of a serendipity story comes from, that name. And it's just a fun adventure story, like it's about shenanigans happening. There isn't a traditional plot. However, it was invented by the Middle East about Sri Lanka. This is a story ancient Persia and people told about this other place. So it's a Sri Lankan story in that it's about them. It wasn't invented there. And there's a whole culture of other people telling stories about other people, rumors, lies, as well as some truths or beliefs, and they just keep spawning and evolving, and they even write history around themselves, like how there's a lot of false beliefs of where the origins of certain stories come from, and then you look at it and you realize that's not the case. It was just these other extenuating circumstances of what happened. And I'm like, if I'm going to do a meta fictive story about the history of storytelling, I should also use a lot of those techniques of lies getting out of control, watching how some similar things start to change and morph and get retold and retold, how historical names change, because there's truth to that, and not similar to like how I talked about how there's co-opted myths that are similar from cultures. Many people have heard the phrase Deus Vult, but what they don't know is that that phrase, or at least Deus, comes from the Proto-Indo-European word for skyfather, which is Deus or Deus. Um, and then that god actually exists in both South Asia and Sanskrit, which evolved from part Proto-Indo-European languages. It exists in the Greek, and it also exists in the Norse and many other places where Deus or Deus Pitar became skyfather, and Pitar became Pita and Pitaji in Sanskrit, which means father, and Deus or Deus became sky. Um, the original name for Zeus wasn't Zeus, and it's not a name. Zeus is Zeus Peter or Zeus Veter, which came from Deus Veter. So Zeus's name is really most often thought to be a title, Sky Father as well, because he's the father of the Olympians. And it eventually became Latinized and Romanized into where we hear it in other cultures today. But it makes you wonder, where did Deus come from to mean God? Is it just really the word for Sky Father from other cultures? But then we have like these ideas that religions have become monoliths of themselves, but there's historical evidence that they were inspiring each other. Creatures were taken from each other. In Zoroastrian um, texts, there's evidence of Indra, who is a god and a good guy, one of the devas from South Asian culture. However, the roles are reversed in that culture, where he's actually one of the bad guys, which I
Oh,
thought was
interesting.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the word asura um, comes from the word asur or ASR from Proto-Indo-European, but then you have the Aesir, who are in the Norse, who also come from the same root and also from Proto-Indo-European. So it made me wonder, like, how many stories were just literally taken and gone like, okay, well, in our culture we want to believe this, or this is what we how we take it, and another culture does the exact same thing. And then there's also the curiosity of, is this a lie versus that, or did they both take from stuff? Like, stories are so nebulous and amorphous that lies can sort of also become truths.
Yeah.
Lies can be built off of truths. Lies can just be lies, and people can later make them true. Which is something I thought I also kind of like made me laugh. Where there's a story about Neil Gaiman where he talked about how he got some of his first jobs, which was he just lied. He's like, I wrote for these magazines and publications, but then I made it a point to go back one day and actually write for them. So I didn't lie. I was just chronologically challenged. And I thought there were all these cool ways of how human storytelling works that I wanted to play with all of them. And Ari's story is as much lies as truth. And I like the idea of you not knowing which things are lies at first, because very early on he introduces his legends to the audience.
Yeah.
And when I started, I'm like, okay, right now these are all lies because the story hasn't been written yet. What can I do with them to either keep them lies, subvert them, play with them, make them truths, or make them things that spiraled out of control, and now are believed as the truth? And I just thought that that was so central, and it made sense to work with the story that I wanted to do and present in the way I wanted to.
Oh, that's super cool. I'm gonna have to go back and listen to this again because we're just, as a history and mythology nerd, there were just so many things you said where I'm gonna have to go and look them all up and have some fun. Because I'm just a nerd that's got to eat the knowledge. I guess is the best way to put it. That's super cool. It actually does make a lot of sense though with what you're saying with just it just makes it just makes like the chapters I've read that much cooler though,
Oh,
knowing
thank you.
like what you were trying to do, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and like it's cool too. I'm glad I actually got to about 10% of the way into the book, and then we had this chat because from like a writer standpoint, it'll be really cool, I think, to see how you've evolved that process within the story itself. So that'd be really cool. Well, that's really interesting. I always wonder too, with just like with how people traveled, like in terms of like Indo-European, because I had a friend who was like a linguist and stuff, and study historical, context for that. And I was always interested, and we had so many cool conversations. And I'm totally blanking on where she's from in Southeastern Asia, but it was just so cool though, because her and I looked at some very old maps, and basically decided like the way that language traveled had to have been different than how we think people physically traveled, if that makes sense. And I had a couple friends who weren't teaching, but they are historians, and they have been working for quite a while, as far as I know, still on that whole process to show what actual migration patterns were. Because I'm thinking my thought on hers was always that she blew my mind when she was like, "Yeah, this is how the language traveled," and then I had a physical map from a teacher, professor, and I was like, "Well, but this is how we say they physically traveled." I said, "So you have two things saying two different things." So to me, it just blows my mind that I to this day haven't seen too much on the subject. And I, as a historian, I get that people don't want things to change because then your narrative changes and people lose power and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Have to
Yeah.
deconstruct the myth, so to speak. I think so, but I'll go back to Tepe is a great example of
Yep.
that.
Yep. I'm glad. I'm
And
so glad you actually brought that up, because I brought that up to somebody else and like, what the hell are you talking about? I'm like, it's such a historic, amazing find, and like what we're learning about how advanced technology was, and like grain mills and people like actually having tools earlier than we thought to process food, but yeah,
yeah.
sorry, we're gonna like freak everybody out watching this who's like, I just wanted to nerd about fantasy. But
Oh
yeah,
my
go on.
god. Oh, I know. But I think that's the point though, is that you're talking about the history and craft of stories, but I like so much about the history and craft of stories, but also I think there's so much you can learn from history. And people always ask me like, "Oh, how'd you do this?" I'm like, because it's real. And
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
what you're saying too, right? It's like this is how people told these stories, and like so you just took the same thing. And I think I'd want to bring it back to fantasy or sci-fi or writing is if you're using real life, as part of your craft, because we said earlier, right? Real life is stranger than fiction, right?
absolutely.
I think that's where you get a unique story like the first binding. So I think it makes total sense. But yeah, I think it's so cool. But yeah, I told somebody the other day about that. I'm like, there's so many things with the timeline, and I talked to some archaeologists I'm trying to bring into my classroom next year, for Global One, which is like ancient civilization up to like whatever Columbian Exchange, 1492 and stuff. I hate talking about that guy, but it's just is so interesting because a lot of like the older ruins and cities and things, like nobody wants to talk about them, particularly in Southeastern Asia. And I had kids ask me like, well, Göbekli Tepe is supposed to be this old, but then you have these ones down here, they're supposed to be this old, and nobody wants to talk about it. I said, yeah, why does anybody want to talk about it? Like, why don't we actually want to know our history, which has only been written down by about 3%? I said, and then that's probably even wrong. So, and I had some kids ask me about the Atlantean myth and stuff. I said, like you're talking about common stories, and I'm like, there's common stories, architecture. I'm like, I just tell them like, I might not believe that they're aliens under the ocean, but I said, whatever we know is a different narrative. So I think that's what
Absolutely.
makes the
Like
first binding
there's a
so.
South Asian Atlantean myth too, of a lost city off of
Yeah.
like the water.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
There's one about that I talked about the goddess Deu from Celtic mythology, and a story about a hero having to cross the body of water to an island to rescue a woman. And that's also one of the main stories in Ramayana and Mahabharata. A similar thing, in this case, is Hanuman crossing the waters to, in this case, go to Lanka or Sri Lanka. But there's so many, again, these archetypal beats from cultures that are thousands and thousands of miles apart. Again, linguistic evidence too. And it's like, how much do people really, really travel? And
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
answer
Yeah.
is a lot. There's a Twitter thread I did about an Indian sailor who there's evidence of, who, because of monsoon winds, was lost and shipwrecked in the Red Sea. And this is how Egyptians learned there was a water path from Egypt to India, which there's a whole network of Silk Road maritime trade that people never really know and talk about.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he ended up being rescued and sailed all the way up to Alexandria, where at that time, it was under I guess, you'd say Greek influence. And he learned to speak Greek, was brought to the court over there, and he started trading and teaching them like how to get Egyptian ships through the Arabian Peninsula down through where the Red Sea is, because there's that entrance from Alexandria all the way down, and getting take use the monsoon winds to get to India. And it opened up a whole network and route of trade. It is massive trade routes, and after that, land routes followed from Anatolia, and then the Romans and others started building watch and guard towers along the way, and you had a land trade route because there's actually the history of an Indo-Greek kingdom called Yavna, which existed, and a Greek king who converted to Buddhism. We know that religion was also one of the greatest traveling things to help convert and trade people and share stories, because India is home to the world's first residential university where people could come live and stay, and it was called Nalanda. But Nalanda spread because of Buddhism, which had reached as far as Japan. So there's records of students from Japan coming to India, like so long ago, including Greek philosophers would come, because this was a university, which is where the ashram that I'm using is inspired by, especially in the courses that it teaches, that taught things from physical fitness, because a lot of these ancient cultures wrestled. They taught philosophy, astronomy, obviously astrology. People did try to pursue magic. I don't think anyone ever graduated in the degree with magic. I don't know how that would have worked. I don't think anyone's pulled magic off, but they believed in it. And there's a lot of fascinating stuff of how religion was also one of those motivators to change and shape stories, not just language and not just trade. It was so many different things, which is why storytelling is so complex yet at the same time similar in so many ways, which I always just found fascinating.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. There was a Netflix TV show that I wish had made it longer, and it was all about like myths and where different myths come from. And I was like, I'm gonna watch it, and then it's probably gonna be all Greek or Roman or whatever, Nordic. And it was like not, and they did such a great job. And they had these amazing like parchment like cartoons that they used, and it was just so amazing. But I'm still trying to like track it down again, because of course they took it off. It only lasted like 10 episodes, but they had
Right.
some just yeah, like amazing stories in there. And it was like definitely my type of thing. But this was like 4 or 5 years ago. And I wish it had actually come out right around the pandemic, because I actually think a lot of writers, would have probably gotten more seasons for it. But it was
Right, right.
absolutely fascinating. I'll have to try and track it down though. And because like if I see the name or like the title, I'll definitely know it. But I'll send it to you, because there were so many cool ones, and there were so many I was like, I'd never heard of this before. And then they talked about like the development of like, oh yeah, this led to this. And yeah, it was really, really cool. It was fascinating. I always thought about trying to track it down and do my own kind of thing on here or something like that. But
That'd be awesome.
yeah, I know, right? So when it comes to world building, what did you focus on the most? And I'm curious, did you like try to send your story more around like Ari and his storytelling, or was it kind of like around the world itself, and then Ari was kind of just like that voice for it?
Both actually. So it was supposed to be Ari's myths and legends as a central character, but he was supposed to serve as like a new proto hero being born in the way a lot of classical heroes were, and we get to see
Cool.
him along with his travels in the present day, seeing how maybe his story's been co-opted by other cultures, because there's a lot of similar stories that you start seeing popping up where they're like, oh yeah, we have this hero from our culture and it sounds a lot like Ari in his name. It's something else, and you don't know if it's influenced by his past of traveling the world and building those legends around the world, because that based on how a lot of stories that we've talked about have actually happened, that's sort of what did happen. And I thought it'd be very fascinating to use one character as a central point for that and show him going
Oh,
through these
that's
other
cool.
cultures, because it's always weird when I see it happening, like in a lot of Western fiction, where it's like it's a character who's done that, but like they mostly travel to just a corner of the world that looks exactly like them. And I'm like,
Yep.
that's not how storytelling really worked. It was never really that
Yeah.
isolated, because there's a great thing called the Ibn Fadlan, which is like the story of Ibn Battuta, who was the Marco Polo before the Marco Polo for the Middle East, and he went as far as Russia from the Middle East, and he had a
Oh, wow.
story. He went had a storyteller with him, and you realize storytellers were the original rock stars, and the reason for that was they were entertainment in a world that didn't have much, but you could capture a tavern, low and high people, and they also broke the ice. Like if you're a foreigner in another country for trade, having a storyteller regale your patrons or whoever's hosting you with epic stories about your journey is a great way to break the ice and endear people to you. So I literally made it Ari's profession as well. And it became this central tool for the world building, where I wanted to have a very different world that where trade is the longer the books go on, and you'll see this in book one, there's a lot of reference of trade going on, trade wars, economic issues, because those were also driving forces, and then storytelling between it, and Ari's using it as both a tool to further himself in the world, open doors for him, as well as get information, but then also he has his own personal motivations that I haven't revealed yet. So it all became interlinked, and a lot of the world building for me was building functional economies and trade routes, so the world had some believability for how stuff and people could move, and already could function within that and earn a living as a storyteller. But then also a lot of the world building happened through actual myths and stories, where I was writing what do these cultures actually believe in, and not just coming up with a religion. It's like, what was the story that inspired that? Just like you have, like, you don't just have like, okay, you have the Olympians. There's individual stories about them, from small things to petty beefs and squabbles to entire overarching narratives like the Titanomachy of how the Olympians came to power. And then you have stuff like, X God was pissed off at somebody because somebody said she was more beautiful than her. And it's such a petty small story, but it still influences the culture. And I was like, that's a fascinating way to world build. Why don't I just actually write the founding myths that people believe in and share and might have inspired later heroes and other heroes and other heroes? Because the story of demigods and mortal heroes within their own context have nods to the gods that inspired them, whether they were beget by a god or descended from this god. Like they never exist in a vacuum. And I just thought that was a really fascinating way to world build. If it's a world about stories, why don't I actually write these fictional stories in the world and let that influence a lot more the narrative and how people believe and function? And then Ari will perform them.
Oh, it's super cool. And you actually just blew my mind, because I actually just realized one thing why I've enjoyed reading it so much is I have like a urban fan part of my urban fantasy is like these ogres that get left here by these overlords, these like sorceress beings and stuff from their realm, and like they end up get left here, and then over time they're fighting with ancient humans, and then that's where you get different myths in terms of my urban fantasy world, like giants, trolls, things like that. And it's really just like them. But I think I like it so much because it's helping me to figure out how I'm trying to, because one of them is going to roll with some very interesting individuals. And I don't want to like give anything away, but like it'll be really cool with how his story pans out. And you'll be like, oh, he's this person and this person from different myths. So I think you've just done such a good job of setting up Ari to not only help us in terms of narration, in terms of world building, but also like to learn more about his character. And I don't think I've seen too many people do both, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you.
So I think you did a really good job with that, and it makes it way more enjoyable, because sometimes people, they like the character, sometimes people like, I'm reading two other books, one, I like the character but the world's like cool, but I like the character a lot and the narrative. But then the other one I'm reading, I really like the world building and not the character so much, if that makes sense. But for Spinding, I like both a lot. So you know what I mean? Like it's just kind of cool to see. I like all three books, but I just like how I think you kind of go, if I can say, a two-prong attack with telling your narrative, with him and his story, but also with building the world in a really unique way by telling the stories in the way you have. And to me, it's just like absolutely fascinating to look at craft that way, especially trying to do something kind of similar, or at least in that type of vein. So I don't know, I found it really enjoyable and really easy to read. And I'm trying to get through my book club book, and I won't mention who the person is because I do feel like I've enjoyed your book a lot more. So it's just kind of ironic to me, because I was really enjoying that person's book, but then I got to yours. I was like, oh, I actually want to listen to this on Audible more. So it's really interesting. But yeah, I've really enjoyed just like how you set up the narrative with him, so, and the world building. So I'm kind of curious now with the Doors of Midnight. So what is something you hope to see happen with the Doors of Midnight when it comes to adding to this world you've already created?
Ooh, so this is a book with a lot of secrets and layers, because I've always loved stories that do that, where you have to go back and reread and learn and find secrets. Um, for example, this is something that came out after book one launched, and it was a particular point of pride because some epics have been written in this way, where there's secrets hidden inside the text that prompt rereading. And then one of my favorite authors, Gene Wolfe, does that a lot, where you have to constantly reread them to find new meaning. And there's a chapter where Ari's telling, it's a nesting story where he's telling essentially a creation story as well as a fall story. And it's written in what seems like normalized prose, but there's a few lines here and there in verse, and there's a section in between it of epic verse, like he's narrating a tiny epic poem. But when some people read it, they realized there's a lot of rhyming couplets and quatrains. throughout the normal prose. And that's important for a few reasons because a lot of South Asian epics hinged on quatrains and couplets specifically, and there's a lot of poetic styles about that. And somebody found out that if you delete all the normalized prose and you leave only the rhyming couplets and quatrains, the entire chapter becomes an epic poem chapter perfectly. The
Oh,
same
wow.
story is there without the extra prose lines, and it perfectly works. And the entire chapter still tells a story, but it's told in a classical way. And it was really funny being able to work that in. I was hoping people would find it. Somebody found it really fast because they're an English teacher.
Wow.
But the funny thing is, my editors never figured that out. And there's a lot of other stuff like that. The Doors of Midnight builds off of that were introduced in book one. Little secrets, if you paid attention, were foreshadowed, and things that will also change how book one actually reads. So if you read book one and you start seeing some of the secrets, book two pays them off. And if you go back and reread book one afterwards, it'll actually change your interpretation of how you process the two books before because you have more context of
Wow.
what happens with the story, which gives you more context of how Ari's narrating and doing certain things, small subtle things, which then if you tie into the nesting stories gives you even more context because it's really circular. But I actually love stories like that, which is like from the writing side, which is what I've enjoyed from the craft perspective. But it's also been really hard because I've had to learn how to do that. And there's not exactly guides on how to write that. It's mostly been figuring it out and taking risks and hoping people eventually figure it out because that's when it pays off.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just me only doing it for my soul entertainment, which is great. But I love stories like that, so I'm really hoping that people find that and also get that joy out of it. But it turns the series into a circular series where the more you reread, every book gets changed. So book three is going to change the first two books before it, as well as pay stuff off, and then four, five, and it just keeps doing that as an Ouroboros. And by the end, the entire story is going to be completely different than what people thought they read.
Oh, wow. So you guys heard it here first. I will be reading Desert Jermaine on Audible, listening to them for the next like 2 years, over and over again. But that's really cool though. I love like little things like that. I always think it's cool when people do things like that because it really shows a higher mastery of craft, and that's what we all want to attain, if that makes sense. It's the same reason I love TikToks and martial arts. I love seeing people do really cool stuff. And I'm like, maybe I can do that and then learn how to do that. So I think it's just really cool when somebody is able to craft that way. So that's like really, really interesting. I'm glad you told me that. So then when it's read Doors of Midnight, I have to go back and then listen to the first binding again. You're making me more and more glad that I got it on Audible. And I still want a physical copy though, because I'm really excited. The one I had seen had like a bunch of tears in it. Like people must have just been flipping through it. And then I went back, I was like, I'm just gonna buy that one for myself. And then somebody had already bought it. So
Oh
my friend,
wow.
I know, right? Isn't that crazy? Like, yeah, it was really nuts. So that's where for my friend and myself, we gotta go in and get some more. So that's what I'm going to do today is ordering 2 copies. But yeah, I like the Kindle because it's easier with my son, but I also do really like the Audible. But I do like certain books. Like there are certain books like yours where I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna need a physical copy because when I go back and reread, that's when I actually like to read, in terms of text. I guess it's because I'm old school like that. Probably the historian piece of me. But yeah, it's really cool to get to go back and reread and see your thought process there. So what is something you want to see grow in terms of your characters and their journeys within the second book, but maybe some of the other ones too? Like what's like kind of like your end goal there, maybe in terms of Ari, that you can tell us, or just the world itself?
With Ari in growing in books two, from one, there's both the past and present narrative where I want more changes to become apparent. Where
Mm.
book one, Ari is a lot more in survival mode because of his situation in his youth, and he's kind of coming into not necessarily a hostile environment, but a place where he might interpret as hostile because he grew up in such a hostile, hard life. And there's a lot of mental illness stuff that goes into this because I've struggled with that. I know people who are neurodivergent, and this is a world without therapy. So it's kind of also bringing to light how a lot of classical heroes get to where they are, but seeing him get an environment that gives him a chance to either interpret things in a broken way still and hopefully learn to grow through them. So book two definitely in the past shows a lot more of Ari's growth to why he's slowly made more of a mature person in the present. Clearly, he's got tragedy and some wounds in the present, but in the first book, he's a lot more of an uppity, kind of like a disaster gremlin, causing a lot more problems, trying to survive, build his reputation, and also be on his quest for vengeance when he's way too young for that. And book two presents him with opportunities to start traveling the world, getting other perspectives on things and people and cultures, and you're going to see some antagonistic relationships of his worsen, but also change in his lens of how he might grow to interpret things. He's going to start learning from an earlier age to be humbled more often, but also still have his triumphs. Him growing more into the Ari of legend that we've seen, as
Mm,
well as the interpretations of how maybe some of the monikers of monster has stuck to him,
mm.
and then how his life also affects the people around him, which is definitely a theme in book one, um, of how he's being able to impact some lives for the positive as well as negative. And then because that there's going to be consequences, repercussions in book two that he has to pay off or meet with, which are also going to be followed up with. Book two is definitely picking up where book one left off, and it's definitely a conversation about starting to live up to everything that he's claimed he's been, for better or worse, and starting to see the seeds of Ari really coming out of his own. I guess like where book one kind of locked him down. He was moving from place to place, out of necessity and need, out of poverty, um, becoming sort of a parent at a young age in a weird way in book one over other young figures, and then a survival sort of situation in school, which he wasn't really meant for because he grew up in a very conflicting, isolating environment that was fraught with danger. And he's technically now in a safe place, but he takes things that might not be actual danger and more just school antagonism in hyper combative and dangerous ways because he grew up in that lifestyle. So for him, everything's kind of survival mode. And book
Yeah.
two really gives him a better idea of what survival mode really is versus what he's thought it's been. And it's going to change him.
And you're speaking to the teacher in me for sure,
Yeah.
from particularly like the student perspective and trying to, get someone to understand who's never understood. Like, I actually am here to help you. I'm not here to harm you,
Yes.
but to try and understand that they might understand that, but they don't understand that sort of thing.
Yes,
So
exactly. No,
that,
that's very well said.
yeah,
Yes. Like
yeah,
hearing and listening are two very different things. And that's actually, I use variations of that line in this book that teachers are also telling Ari, like, you hear us, you're not listening. There's a very different skill involved. Like, listen to some advice. Like, I understand you want certain things. We're telling you that what you might want could hurt you, and there are reasons
mhm,
why, and we'd rather you not get hurt. But he's a
yeah,
teenager, so he's like, no,
yeah,
I'm immortal. I'm made of rubber glue. Everything bounces off me and sticks to you. Like, you can't hurt me.
yeah,
And then he
yeah.
gets humbled, and he's like, wow, I maybe shouldn't have said that.
Yeah. I had somebody come to me after a few years out of school. They're like, just like randomly messaged me. They're like, "Well, you were right." And I was like, "About which thing?" I didn't even say hi. I was just like, "About which thing?" And I had such a great relationship with the kid. They're like, "Yeah." They're like, "I just want you to know, like, we hear you. It might be a couple years later, but we hear you." And I was like, "Well, I was just trying to help." So definitely understand that. Got some great themes there, which I do, like seeing them pretty early, in book one. So
Right.
and they just make his character, I think, just have a lot more depth because he doesn't just seem real, he feels real, and has real struggles. So I think that is an awesome job with writing on your part, because
Thank
it
you.
just yeah, it just makes him more compelling. And I think we've all, been there at some point in our lives. And I don't know, I like when people write characters like that instead of these 2D dimensional, yeah, characters where you can't really connect with. I think that's where I think personally that your indie background comes in, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
um yeah, so I don't know, I've just seen that a lot more with people who either are indie or have roots with indie. But I also see a lot of people with traditional publishing too. Travis is one, really trying to come in and write authentic characters. And I think Legends and Latte shows that people really want, those types of characters, that they can feel, they can connect with. I think that's where Harry for me is one where I'm like, man, Harry, do I get it? I got to a point where I think I'm in book 8 right now listening, and I'm just like, I get it, man. Like, that's how I feel teaching right now. Like, I've been doing this thing for like 17 years, and I just really am connected with Harry right now. Like, having to be a warden now and just different stuff, and being disenfranchised,
Yep. Yep.
being part of the establishment. Like, I just totally get it. But no, it's super cool. So we got our last question here. It's been awesome. Do you have any news updates or current projects, anything like that you can share with us?
Uh, yeah, I got a few things. One is I'm currently working on a Tales of Tremaine like side stories collection that I'm hoping to get
Oh,
done
awesome.
sooner than later, and I kind of want to give it as a gift to everyone who supported the book. So the digital will be free. One that legally I can do that with my contract, thankfully, because I'm not trying to profit off of the ebook, and it's got a short story from Ari's cat's POV Shola. That's a spoiler, but
Awesome.
Ari ends up rescuing a cat. It's the book's been out long enough. I think it's a small spoiler. It picks up where book two's past story ends. I mean, book one's past story ends, but before book two starts. So it's kind of like his winter break. And then there's a novella from Ari's POV during that same week. And then there's another character. I don't know if you've gotten to meet him yet, but he's a character called Krisham, who is unfortunately um, mentally struggling with a lot. He's got a sort of a magically inflicted case of a mental illness,
Hmm.
very close to DID or dissociative identity disorder.
Oh,
And it's the
interesting.
first time you're going to get to see his point of view with his life, where he's kind of in the school's version of like a mental asylum, but he's one of the only students that's not locked up 100%. So you kind of get to learn why he's not and what he's really capable of and more about him. I've gotten 3 or 4 stories written and done in that, and then I have to write Krisham's. The cover for that's coming along pretty well. And I just sold another novelette in that world, which is a story that Ari's telling. So it's a fictional story from his world that he's recounting to the audience, and you
Oh,
actually get
cool.
to see the story of another character who may or may not have existed. For a wonderful anthology with Sean Speakman, who runs Grim Oak Press, which
Hmm.
has done a lot of special editions and anthologies over the years. And he's doing a Kickstarter one with indie authors, but also some traditional ones who've done hybrids. So I get to, which is gonna be really cool to be in that.
Oh,
And then the
cool.
other weirdest news is I actually have a thriller out on submission, like a contemporary normal thriller, inspired by a lot of the life I had growing up, where it follows the point of view of an immigrant cab driver, because that was the life of my dad in DC, in the aftermath of DC being the cocaine and murder epicenter of the world,
Oh,
or at least the United States, because in the 90s it was, and unfortunately it's still a really prevalent drug, and there's still some crime rates here and gang issues, and the novel follows that through an immigrant POV, and we actually have that on
hmm.
submission right now. So
Oh, cool.
more of how careers, I guess, can be weird because I had to start a new pen name to launch more contemporary, mainstream, non-speculative works.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That sounds awesome. I actually totally forgot that I heard you say that somewhere. It sounded very interesting. So I'm definitely, I haven't been reading a thriller in a while, so I've been wanting to again because I want to do like kind of like a horror fantasy thriller, if that makes sense. I don't
Oh,
know.
it
I
does,
don't
yeah.
know what it
I
is.
mean,
Yeah, I just think it'd be
thriller
cool.
pacing is really good. I
Yeah.
always, when I teach, explain like every genre has something to learn for. Like if you want
Yep.
emotional arcs and emotional catharsis, romance is the best to read because Tales of Tremaine also has a huge romantic arc, and it's set to an actual structure of a romance,
Oh,
including even
cool.
some of the epic stuff. The epic stuff has an emotional catharsis, not a traditional climax, but an emotional catharsis can still be really fulfilling. A good example is like Luke using the Force. Like there's the climax part where he blows up the Death Star, but the emotional catharsis is him being introduced to the Force by Obi-Wan and struggling with it, and then he has the ability to like hit it. He finally makes the unsinkable shot by trusting and using the Force. That's an emotional arc right there of him coming full circle to this spiritual numinous realization payoff. It can
Yeah.
have physical results, but it doesn't have to be.
Oh, that's
And
super cool.
thrillers are the best for pacing to
Yeah,
start.
yeah, yeah. No, totally. Well, that's super cool. Thank you so much. Again, we just want to remind everybody, to any book, any Audible, those kind of things, really any product that we've had anybody on, just want to make sure you're reviewing those. That really just helps everybody. Traditional, non-traditional, it doesn't matter in terms of publishing. It just helps everybody. It helps, people's cover artists, audio narrators, stuff like that, editors. Thank you so much for coming on. This has
Thank you for
been
having me.
great. Anytime you want to hop on, talk about whatever, just let me know. I feel like at some point we gotta have a conversation just about like storytelling, or maybe we'll just do a fun thing about go back to
Oh,
Tepe,
absolutely.
it's like crazy stuff. But yeah, this has been awesome. Make sure you guys go and check out, if you're new to the podcast, check out the description. You can find our Virdi's links, all the socials, everything there. Make sure you check out the first binding. I will, as soon as I'm done, this month, have my review up. I'm super behind on reviews, but now that I'm pretty much done with school, I'll be catching up. You have asked for them, so we will do them. So make sure you check out mine on the first binding. I hope you have a good rest of the day, my friend. If you need anything
Thank you. You
else,
too,
just
man.
let me know, and yeah, I'll help you out with it. But other than that, it's been
Appreciate it.
fabulous. I gotta
Thank you, man.
go back now and go listen to some more of the first binding while I do some chores and stuff. So I'm excited
And
about
I gotta
that.
make sure I send you the other codes for the
Oh, cool. Thank
yeah,
you so
yeah, yeah.
much.
No
I
problem.
appreciate it. All right, my friend. Well, I will hopefully see you later. Talk to you
Yeah.
somewhere on social media. But other than that, hope you have a great rest of the day.
You too, man. Thanks.
See you later.
See-